Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, 30th of August, and you are watching episode 103 of Regional Rap. Regional Rap, providing insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, local council, relevant or wayward, is my guest Dean Hurlston, President of the Council Watch. For over 20 years, Council Watch committee and members have lobbied and dedicated their personal time to ensure local government is held to account. They are regularly involved in all industry consultations and submissions to the sector. Council Watch advocates for high quality and high impact services that benefit the whole community. With increased rates every year burdening households, they seek to ensure that every dollar spent delivers value for money for all residents and ratepayers, and of course, hold the councils to account for their spending. Councils are more often making determinations with little or no consultation, while some agreements are made in confidence and remain closeted in secrecy. Council Watch believes the cornerstone of local government must be transparency within all parts of councils, operations, and good councils should release as much information as possible to their communities to ensure that the ratepayers understand the decisions being made that affects their life. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you.
It's interesting goings on with councils now, and it's changed a lot from when I first took notice. I probably took notice of councils back in the 80s, living in Victoria, out in Wantirna. We had the city of Knox, and a friend of mine decided to run for mayor. So I got a bit of an overview of how it worked and the elections. And at that stage, there wasn't that much party politics in it. It was mainly people of sort of reasonable character and well known in the community overall that sort of vied for the position of councillor and mayor. And they were also, all they got for it, I think the mayor of Knox in the 80s, I think they might have got an honorarium or something like that of about $28,000 to do their duties and that, and also I think the mayor actually had a car. But I think councillors were probably only on about maybe an allowance of about $12,000, and there was no specific perks, but their time was always in demand.
Yeah, and these days mayors are on substantially more. Certainly in the state of Victoria, the average mayor salary is, over $100,000 a year plus car and other expenses, and that for some people can be quite a lucrative little career step.
And the other thing is they can actually work their own job as well. Yes. So if they're running a little business or they're actually employed somewhere, but usually most of the ones I know, they seem to be either self-employed or that, so they can manage to sort of do that without worrying their employer, having to worry an employer. So it can be sort of very financially viable. And the other thing is, there doesn't seem to be have to be a number of hours in the office sort of thing. It's sort of, there's no sort of set rules, I think.
No, we see many mayors across many municipalities work, maybe 1 day a week, maybe two, maybe a few hours here and there. Many mayors are actually fitting it in with their actual full-time job. We've got a bit of a problem with that. If you are earning that kind of money as a mayor, you should pretty much be working, at least 3 to 4 days a week. If you're, turning up to the offices every Friday or Monday and working a full-time job as well, that's kind of disingenuous from where we sit. So, you should at least be having to take less money if you're not doing that in a full-time or at least 3 or 4 days a week capacity.
Well, the thing is, at that rate, sort of people can't be across all the detail of the issues coming across. And I think what's worse, I don't think they're actually, a lot of them aren't across the processes and procedures as much as they should be. And a lot of them come foul of the state integrity body, whether it's a Crime and Corruption Commission, like in Queensland, and you have your own body down in Victoria. And we see regularly throughout a lot of councils, there's mayors and council members who are sidelined. I think the mayor of Cairns was sidelined for over 6 months because of investigation. So, but I'm sure it's still drawing pay.
Yeah, look, obviously in Victoria, we have IBAC, which is the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission. And IBAC recently, some of your listeners and viewers might have seen, recently released a report that was over 5 years in the making into Casey Council in Victoria. And that was Operation Sandon. And that was really highlighting risks in the councillor system, specifically around rezoning and planning decisions. Where there were allegations that councillors were receiving money and other benefits or gifts or things that they might like in order to influence their decisions. And the outcomes of the Casey, the investigation were really quite damning, saying how easy local government is. And kind of what I want everyone to realise is that local government says that it's got a lot of integrity and that it's really, really good at calling out conflicts of interest, but it's actually not. We've seen every government body that oversees this kind of conduct, so whether it's the Ombudsman, the Local Government Inspectorate, ASIO, the Auditor General in Victoria, we've seen these bodies come out with evidence and reports in the last 5+ years showing that local government is actually a soft target. It's actually got some of the highest levels of corruption and risks of corruption in Australia, in any level of government. And to your point earlier, when you and I were chatting offline, local councils are not a third level of government. People think they are, they're not. They are actually a delegated part of the state government in each state. They are literally just a bunch of functions that the state government has outsourced through to a statutory body that has elected representatives to weigh in from a community perspective and essentially give their view and balance out the administration's view. So the real issue that we have is that local government is rife with corruption risks, and those risks are really, really high. Yesterday, IBAC released a report in Victoria that showed 76% of councillors in Victoria believed local government had serious corruption risks and problems. And that's an astronomical figure. 76% of elected members felt that there was serious corruption within councils. That tells us there's a culture problem, there's a secrecy problem, there is a lack of transparency, and something has to change dramatically.
Yes, and one of the things is I get the feeling that, as you said, the local councils are not a level of government, but they've become the very useful idiots of very lazy state governments. The state government delegates out a power or offers it to the councils, and the councils go, we'll do that, we'll gladly have it. But the state government doesn't give them the necessary funding, doesn't give them the overall authority either. So it's just a botch of a handover, and then it becomes a bit of a bun fight in regards to if there's an issue. Well, it's the state governments, and the state government saying, no, it's local. And, we have a problem up here with bats at times. And it's the state government says, oh, it's not our problem, it's your problem. And then of course, they try to point out the federal government as well. Well, the environment minister, like, you got all these functionaries, but no one can make a decision.
Yeah, look, we have the same issue in Victoria. You would only ask any average Victorian whether they live in regional Victoria or metro Melbourne, and you'll find that the biggest issue that's consistent across all councils is the poor state of our roads. Melbourne's roads and Victoria's roads are appalling compared to some of our other colleagues in other states. We have got some of the worst roads I've ever seen, and that's come from state government neglect for a very long time, and also council neglect. And it is, as you say, it's always a bun fight between, is it a council road? Is it a Vic Road state-owned road? Who's to blame? Who didn't fund it? And it's always, the fingers pointing at each other. No one wants to actually say, hey, it's our problem, we'll fix it. But what we do have in Victoria is, as you say, a lot of cost shifting as well, a lot of blame, and that useful idiot concept. In Victoria, we have 3 council bodies, peak bodies, and that's the MAV, Municipal Association of Victoria, Local Government Professionals, LG Pro, and the Victorian Local Government Association. All 3 of them are constantly whinging that the state government cost shifts everything to councils. So we decided to make them put their money where their mouth was. And Bill, we wrote to every council and asked them on public record, how much is the state government cost shifting to you a year that you didn't want? Literally no more than 5 out of our 79 councils had any ability to answer that question. So when you use the term useful idiots, we probably couldn't agree with you more, because they're out there in the press almost weekly complaining, cost shifting, it's costing us a fortune. Well, that's a really great statement to make, but you haven't quantified it. You don't know what it is and you can't answer the question. That's what a useful idiot does. They say things not based on fact.
Yeah, another thing is too, we just touch on the condition of roads. Well, councils are always put there, people say, well, they're there for rates, roads and rubbish.
Yeah.
However, over the last probably generation, maybe or so, it's local councils have become more political. It's a springboard for a lot of budding politicians, especially the Greens seem to use it fairly effectively. And they've got tied up with a lot of other issues. I mean, I just remember that I think when it basically started and got my attention is with the Sydney City Council, and they were in that BDS, and in other words, boycotting anything that was from Israel. And that's foreign policy, it's not it's not your domain. You go, but no, they went on with it, and it's still part of the thing. And then of course we moved on to climate change and every other social issue that you can have. And with the budget of the council on these sort of events, gender inclusion, all the other social issues, would eat up a huge part of the budget. And would always take out from obviously the core business, and that's. Do you have any idea how that sort of percentage has grown over the years? Because to me, all I ever heard, you go onto the website for the Cairns Council and you can look at it, and there's all these things that are going on, but they've got nothing to do with rates, roads, and rubbish.
Yeah, Bill, what we've seen councils do, and one of the things we did a bit of research in Melbourne, and our research, one of our research projects came out really clearly that the over-politicisation party politics style in local government is not what people want. Unlike state and federal elections, locals in Victoria, and I dare say it's probably similar across all of Australia, over 90% of people didn't want candidates and parties, particularly in local government. They wanted strong local independent people who would actually stand up for the community. So that's a really clear sign to political parties. It's not a harvesting ground, and in fact, people don't want that. What we do know is that there's a lot of candidates who claim to be independent, but they actually are political operatives and don't disclose it. So that's a concern. But you are right. What we've seen in the last 20 or so years in local councils is a service provision organisation that's really there for roads, rubbish, rates and services, maternal health care, aged care, all of those things that we expect, libraries, all the stuff that we expect from a council, that we expect them to do well. And what we've seen is a complete reverse of that. We've seen those service standards fall dramatically in the last 10 years. We've seen the community satisfaction around those core services be at the worst levels that they've ever been at. So people now, half the population aren't even happy with those core services. And what we've seen instead is a distraction and a rise of social, global and, international geopolitical status. I mean, I don't know about you, but recently we had a council in Melbourne, good old Marybeth Council, that was Moreland Council, renamed from Moreland because the name had links to slavery some long time ago. So without proper consultation, the community didn't get a say. It was basically thrust upon them at a cost of millions of dollars that they didn't want to spend. And then that same council decided to, issue a motion for nuclear non-proliferation. Well, I don't know about you, but the last time I found a council hoarding nuclear weapons under its town hall, pretty non-existent, and I haven't seen it yet. So, them having a nuclear non-proliferation zone in their own council was literally the most stupid thing I'd ever heard of. I have no problem with a council in theory wanting to make sure that there's no nuclear weapons, but in practical sense, to debate that kind of thing in a metropolitan chamber where there is not even a nuclear power plant within thousands of kilometres, it made no sense. And this is what we keep seeing. We see this social engineering rise of social and political issues that have no place in local government, certainly not in regional councils. Regional councils are under some of the biggest financial pressures to deliver some of the largest, geographical spreads of roads, of footpaths, of infrastructure. And these councils, to really be fair to regional councils who cover some of the most amazing geographical areas, they are running on the smell of an oily rag. And they are not as sexy and as great at doing presentations in Canberra and, within their own state governments. And so the metropolitan councils also tend to vacuum up all of the big grant money that they should be getting their fair share of. And so what we keep seeing in regional councils is this enormous financial pressure to do so much more with so little, and ratepayers struggling to see that, things, basic infrastructure is being upgraded and maintained. And these poor regional councils are really being treated so disingenuously by the state and federal government, where they're not looked after first and they're not given the lion's share of grant funding because they're not the metropolitan counterparts. And what that's doing is it's really allowing metropolitan councils to waste money on infrastructure, to waste money on big, shiny, new stadiums, new sports arenas, whatever they want to do, whilst the basic streets and roads in regional councils across Australia are absolutely faltering and being left, 10 or 20 years underfunded. The problem we have is you can't keep doing that. You just can't keep doing that, because all you'll do is break down those regional councils and make it worse for them and make them unsustainable. And it's just not good enough. It really isn't good enough from our state and federal governments.
I think one of the things there, it's interesting that you pick the difference between metropolitan and regional councils. One thing about the local metropolitan councils, some of those councils actually take in two state electorates at times, which is the reverse of out in the regions. We're one seat, one lower house seat can have a couple of different regions in it and only have one representative. So in the city like Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney, you've got the situation where your political representation at that state and federal level is quite high. And if you've got an issue, you can run to your local member or the federal member and lobby them or whatever. But when you get out to the regions, you haven't got that same number of representatives out there. So there's a bit more dependence on the councils to represent you in a way. But then, they're not a level of government, but a lot of people are expecting them to do some heavy lifting. Now, up here in Cairns, we have the Cairns Regional Council. Now, that looks after a regional side area, but basically you got a situation where come election time, we have the Cairns Regional Council, the local Advanced Cairns group, and maybe the Chamber of Commerce and some other people. They have their convoy to Canberra to sort of put in their wish list as though they actually can get grant money or get something out of the state government. And then when something happens after that event and they get $2 million, well, then they pat themselves on the back because, that was successful going down to Canberra. And then the same thing with state budgets. We have what I call is the councils going down to Brisbane with their begging bowls for, this favour and that favour, and the same at elections. But that's the sort of thing that's happened in the regions, that there is this dependency or on the councils to sort of lobby for those things that the state and federal government should be giving you. What do you think the situation is in sort of regional Victoria as well in that situation because of the lack of federal and state representation out in the regions?
Yeah, I think you touch on a really important point there. Some of our regional areas in Victoria and indeed across regional Australia are absolutely underrepresented because representation in politics is based on population and thereby density. And so you are correct. You know, for me, sitting in metropolitan Melbourne, I can get to my local state MP who's just down the road. I can get to all of my councillors. They're not geographically spread. They're all within, 10 kilometres of each other. And I can get to even my federal member who's sitting literally a couple of kilometres from me. So it is really, really unfair that if you're sitting in a metropolitan area, you can get to all three levels pretty quickly, pretty easily. It's quite accessible. Whereas if I'm sitting in a regional area, I've got less representation spread over a much larger geographical area. And I think one of the things that we see a problem at state and federal level from a funding perspective is that we keep applying the same population density metric to the way grants and funding for local councils and top up, sort of funding from state and federal comes, instead of actually balancing that out with, we also need to look at the geography. If there's a municipality in Melbourne that's got a 10-kilometre square council within it, but you've got, and it's got 150,000 people in it, it's going to get a lot more money from federal and state than the equivalent population in, a 500 square kilometre radius in WA. And I think that that's a problem because, yes, of course, you have to fund where the people are to some degree, but you also have to place a geographical lens across that, particularly to balance out regional. And I think there's not enough work done to ensure that regional councils are getting their fair share of funding. They're often treated as the poor cousin. It's not okay. I mean, local councils that are flush with $50 million surpluses and building these wonderful projects year on year that are discretionary, they're not basic infrastructure. That's great, but it's coming at the cost and the expense of the basics in regional Victoria or regional Australia, where they're not even able to keep up with roads and footpaths.
The other thing is too, with this situation, it doesn't seem to get any better. I mean, we have amalgamations, or I don't know how Victoria's gone for amalgamations, but New South Wales went through amalgamations in about 2015, 2016. I think Queensland went through under the Bligh government, and then there was some of it was reversed in under the new government, but at the expense of the councils. If they wanted to de-amalgamate, they had to cover all the costs. But the thing is, we're still. I'll just show a map. I'll show a screenshot here. But we've still got some five. All right, there we are, full shot. We've still got 535 local councils across Australia. Queensland's got 77. How many did you say you had? About 70 odd as well?
79 in Victoria.
Ah, well, there you go. So that's a lot of councils. And
Yeah,
do you think there needs to be more amalgamation and of the inner city ones?
Yes, definitely.
And then say maybe the regional councils can be broken down a little bit more, so they're not covering such big area, and get some reasonable funding as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think certainly in some of the metro areas, like certainly New South Wales, parts of Queensland, small parts of WA and South Australia, and certainly Victoria, and a little bit of Tassie. But certainly in the major capital cities, there is an over representation of councils in the metropolitan area, and that could be rationalised. And the issue you're going to have around that is the funding spread. There's so much work that would need to go into redistributing the funding into regional areas. Look, our view is this. Yes, it would be great to amalgamate some of those councils, but what we would rather see in the short term to really, inject some capital into regional Australian councils where they're struggling is a better grant system that literally disadvantages to some degree the highly cashed up metropolitan councils. I don't want to see a metropolitan council in Melbourne or Sydney that's got a $50 million surplus getting a 20 or a 30 or a $40 million grant federally and state, from state to federal to build a new swimming pool, when some of the councils in regional Australia are so strapped that $10 million could be the difference for them between, upkeeping their roads to a safe standard. We think there has to be two styles of infrastructure grants, and those, mandatory grants should be what state and federal look at first, and almost, in a sense, fund those 4 councils that are really struggling with money before they consider anything else. It should be that the cashed up metropolitan councils are last, because they don't need the money. They want it. There's a difference between want and need. Want is great because that just says, hey, we've got some free money and we can do something that we weren't maybe going to do before, but it's not necessarily mandatory. Whereas regional councils absolutely need the cash just to be able to drive on safe roads. And I think regional Australia really has the right, from everything that we've seen in the last decade, to be really upset with both state and federal governments that they are constantly being left out in the cold. You mentioned before when we were chatting about the local government associations that run around each state and sort of federally. There was only about a month or so ago, maybe a little bit more, a national conference that happens every year for the Australian Local Governance Association in Canberra. Now, all of those 500 councils were invited to send representatives. And I just want your viewers and listeners to think about this for a minute. Over $1.5 million of ratepayers' money was spent to send a bunch of councillors and some CEOs and some executives to Canberra for a 4-day conference. We're not against industry conferences, but what did that deliver back to the communities that actually are funding this? Not very much at all. It's a junket. And whilst we know that each council is a state-mandated statutory body, they have no relationship federally other than if they're asking for a federal grant. So there's no need for them to collectively go and lobby all in the same 4 days. Well, they were actually at a conference and they claimed they were lobbying. Yes, a lot of them got around to see politicians, but I'd challenge any council to come forward and say it resulted in a 20 or a 40 or a $50 million grant for a council. What we keep seeing is this industry wasting money, telling everyone that it's trying and it's really trying to do the right thing, and we're trying to lobby the right people. And instead, what should happen is that regional councils should get a seat at the table with federal and state ministers first. It should be done as ordinary part of business, and they should be at the front of the grant queue, not at the rear begging for the crumbs off the table. And these junkets need to stop. You're talking hundreds of people descending on Canberra, over $1.5 million. We know because we did an FOI and looked at those costs across the councils, and it's just sheer waste. It doesn't do anything to advance the lack of funding in regional councils across Australia. And I'd actually rather that regional councils all got together, formed their own collective body that had nothing to do with these high cashed up metropolitan cousins, and actually started saying, as regional councils, we want a seat at the table and we want, better negotiating power together.
Well, I don't know how your one in Victoria works, but the association in Queensland, the northern Queensland has a sort of, or it used to, I think it's changed now. They used to have a conference, and about maybe 15 or so councils met, and then they went to the state conference, and all 77 councils were represented there. And they can put forward motions and things like that. But the thing is, the voting system is, like, if you're just I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but we've got councils like Richmond and Concurry and that, they've only got 800 or 900 people in the whole shire and that. And I think that they get the basic 2 votes. Cairns might get about 6 votes. But if you're down on the Gold Coast, because of your population and that, you probably get 10 votes. And then if you're Brisbane, well, you get 14 votes. So they go to this conference, the regional people, and they put up a motion. You can bet your little bitty that more people might vote for it, but the number of votes that are allocated, they're just swamped and overwhelmed by the southeast corner number of votes that they're entitled to have. And so what they get onto the agenda doesn't usually get through.
Yeah, there's a real sense of inequity because you are, again, already coming from a disadvantaged base that your population isn't giving you adequate funding because the government is just looking, whether it's state or federal, at, oh, you've only got 500 people, so we won't give you anything or we won't give you much. But secondly, your representation is diluted where you've got those bigger councils and bigger voting blocks, and that's really disappointing in the design. Look, another thing that happened in Victoria that you might remember is that our Premier promised everybody a lovely Commonwealth Games for the state. And, we were thrilled, whilst sceptical when it was announced, we were thrilled that there was a real focus on regional towns and regional partnership throughout Victoria, because there was a real sense that it would really boost some of these local economies in some of our regional areas. And that it's lovely to do something like that where you decentralise and it's not just good old Melbourne that wins it all the time. And so it was a real big win for many councils that they could see this amazing economic activity coming, this incredible opportunity to be, a proud host of a number of events or an athletes village or a bit of both. And there were many councils in Victoria, probably at least 6 or 7, that started hiring staff to gear up for the preparation and the works required. And they were really abuzz and really excited. And then for it to all be dropped on its head when suddenly the Premier announced that it was being cancelled, it was really disappointing. I suppose it would have been disappointing if it was Metro Melbourne, but it was almost an extra kick in the guts to these regional towns that have done it so tough through COVID, that have probably done it tougher than a lot of, dense metropolitan population where there was enough people to kind of get through those things. And a lot of the businesses have struggled. They've managed to survive. Some have gone under, of course. The towns were, really trying to recover from, in a lot of cases, industry change and, things that had happened in the last 20 years, whether they had been a producing kind of town geared around production, and that had all gone and they'd kind of morphed into more of a tourist town that had, resurgence of other new industries coming through. And this was kind of like the silver lining, that they could see some hope that there was going to be a really good event coming forward. And then lo and behold, the Premier just, kind of pulls the rug from under everyone. And yet again, it was regional towns that suffered. Metropolitan Melbourne went, oh, that's disappointing. Wasn't really going to affect us anyway. But it just really, it shut down all of the infrastructure that was being planned. It shut down all of the tourism that people were gearing up for. Just such a bad look to ever do something like that to regional Victoria.
Well, I remember the Commonwealth Games 2018 in Gold Coast.
Yep.
Well, a lot of the people in Gold Coast thought it was a bloody big inconvenience,
That's metropolitan people for you. We're like that.
Basically upset their routine and that, because there's so many. But the other thing is, it's like a lot of things in regional areas is, even when they do get a nice gift from the government, whether it's federal or state, it's always the state who implements it. The federal government might give the money, but it's the state that spends it and actions it. But one of the other big problems for the regions is if there's a multi-million dollar contract. Well, the first thing that happens is all the tenders go out in such a way that the only people who get it is a big building company like, I don't know, Civil and City, I don't know, Horny, from down in Melbourne, and they win it. All union people turn up. They're all turned up on the basis of they got all this travel allowance and accommodation allowance that jacks up the price of the whole project. And the local people and businesses don't really get. They might get something, but it's a minor share in compared to the overall project. And it's not as though they haven't got the capability of doing it. It's just that they are basically stopped in the tender process because they're not a big enough or a recognised entity. That's something probably that should be looked at as well, to make sure when something goes to the region, it's as much as possible is done through local companies and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that we do see when we look at procurement, tendering, contracting. Regional councils do it quite well as far as making sure that the work is going to, local companies, to more regional based, smaller to medium sized enterprises. Whereas Metro Melbourne, they run straight to the big construction companies or the well-known ones, and that's what they do. We'd argue that often puts an extra layer of cost on it, because there is, the bigger you are, the more you charge generally, because you've got a bigger infrastructure and a bigger reputation and a bigger marketing bill and all those things. Whereas what we do see is some really good high quality work come out of regional councils, where they're doing a small, $1 or $2 million project and subcontracting to local companies to do the work. Because those companies are also local, there's a lot more riding on it. They're known, they know everyone in the community, there's a sense of community pride, and in fact, civic pride is really big in regional communities. So the last thing you're going to get is a contractor who does a half dodgy, half-baked job that has to face everyone in the pub every week when they get it wrong. So one of the things we know is that we get higher quality and a much better connection to the community from those local providers. And it's something that I think regional councils could really teach some of their silly cousins in the metro councils, who just love to use some of the big bodgy companies sometimes who do a really crappy job and walk away because they've got nothing invested beyond that contract long term. Whereas what we know is in regional towns, if you have to live there and you bugger up that job, you're going to be held to account, and you're probably going to go back and fix that pretty quickly if you got it wrong, because everyone down the pub is going to rib you for the next 10 years that you got it wrong. So there is much better delivery of smaller projects like that in regional towns.
That's why there needs to be a system a little bit to break jobs down, so they're not all put into a total sum where a big contractor goes. Because I don't know, I basically remember going back to the old GFC and the school building programs and things like that. Now, the people who got the best bang for their buck was the good old Catholic schools. They looked after their own stuff. They because the overall project didn't go into the $2 million, they could get anyone they contracted. And of course, within a community like a church and things group like that, well, you have all these contacts, and you do get good prices. It's not as though they're doing any shocking under the counter thing, but they just get value for money. And
no one wants to rip off a church, do they? it's not going to help you much at the pearly gates if you say, I really screwed them over. It's not a good look.
Now the state schools up in Ballarat, they got their shade cover things and outdoor shade covers, and they got the little crampy canteens. But because what happened is that the state government amalgamated several schools into the pool, so it was over $2 million. So that allowed a big contractor from Melbourne to come up, accommodate people and make make a good feed out of it without getting good results. So you have a look at the school, the state school. It's got a pokey little useless new canteen and a shade cover outside. And the Catholic schools got this great new building annex on it.
I'd say it's built half school.
So they're the things. Maybe there should be some action in regards to make sure these projects are broken down into modules and that, where the locals can fairly tender for them and have a good chance of getting the job.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think councils offer a really good opportunity for small businesses to grow, to find projects that they can do, and to gain experience in a reasonably low risk situation when we are talking about those smaller amounts. And I think local councils in regional areas
Oops.
are such an important employer in that space. They really are from a contractor point of view. They're not just, as you say, shipping in 100 workers day in, day out from other suburbs like happens in Metro. And it is really important that that money generally stays in the economy. It's not leaving those suburbs and going somewhere else. When you are using local businesses, that whole flow-on effect is, well, the rates money that was collected to do that project, whether it's $2 million worth of road upgrades, is generally going to stay in that area and be spent back through the retail and businesses and services in the community. So everybody wins. It's so much worse in metropolitan Melbourne when you see, a large construction company coming in and building a $50 million or a $60 million aquatic centre. And it's great for 2 years while there's all these union workers on side and there's all these, activity happening. But what happens, all of that money just disappears and goes back, all that labour cost just goes back out into other areas and doesn't actually stay in the community that generated it. So I think there is a positive effect of these sorts of things and of grant funding for these things from a state and federal level into regional towns. It's the difference because it's the lifeblood, it's feeding the economy, as opposed to we're just building a project in this metropolitan council and everyone's leaving. I think there is a really, really big focus that needs to be had, as you say, on those smaller council jobs that really can feed back into the economy.
One of the other thing is if you want actually to grow the pie for Australia in general, if you spent your one was a classic. You're going to spend nearly $200 billion on a loopy railway, right?
Yep.
And that will never generate a dollar of wealth. That thing, public transport does not generate wealth. It's something that's subsidised forever. Every journey by every person is subsidised by the taxpayer.
Correct.
It's a liability forever. It's a maintenance thing forever, and nothing. If you spend $1 billion out in the regions building a new dam or a new economic corridor, like improve the road system or something like that, you would generate more wealth, because you improve the amenity, people are going to move out there, there's got to be more likely jobs. So money spent this is what really irks me being in the regions is if you spend $1 billion in regional New South Wales, Queensland, or what, you are going to generate wealth. You're going to create wealth and it's going to be benefit to all Australia. You spend, like we're spending, started $5 billion Cross River Rail, under the river. It's not going to come. You're not going to get any change out of $12 billion, and that's a liability. It does not generate a dollar of wealth after it's running. Again, it's public transport. It has to be subsidised by the taxpayer, and just maintenance, and there's nothing out of that $12 billion in the end. So,
well, I think you've picked up on a really good point there. I was just thinking while you were saying that, imagine what we heard today, that the debt levels in Victoria are going to hit, possibly $200 billion or more. And I'd like to think, imagine what we could do with $150, $200 billion if we just took that money, or if we even took 50 billion from every state, and we actually invested in our regional towns with a few $100 billion, it would transform communities and lives in ways that it could never do in a metropolitan context. And it would actually, in many cases, probably allow generations more people to actually live and raise families in particular regional areas and allow them to prosper and grow businesses, etc., and generate wealth. We know there's already enormous pressure on many regional towns that are losing population, losing people to bigger regional areas or to the fringes of CBD. That's heartbreaking. These towns have been around in some cases for so many generations, and we're now seeing the difference between investing in them and them withering and dying. The sake of $10-20 million, it would make all the difference. So if we were to spend some hundreds of billions of dollars that we're wasting on rubbish, particularly in Victoria, if we were to actually pick that up and say, let's invest in regional Victoria to that extent, it would transform our regions like nothing else.
But the other thing, there'd be great benefit for the capital cities, because what would also happen is, because you make the regionals more livable, give them more amenity and there's job opportunities, you might actually take the pressure of population off those major cities, because I reckon Melbourne would be much more livable if there was 1 million less people in it.
Well, you're not wrong there. And the really bizarre thing is, and we talk about this in council watch all the time, the state government's got it arse about. Instead of actually saying, hey, we need to put 1 million more people into regional towns to boost them, to make them grow, to actually really bring up our regional towns and take the pressure off everything needing to be CBD centric or Melbourne centric. Instead of doing that, what we're hearing from the state government is, we need to take all planning away from councils and take local decisions away, because we have to fit 1 million people more in the next decade into our existing metropolitan suburbs. Now, as someone who's grown up in Melbourne my entire life and been to every, corner of Australia, Melbourne's great in many ways, but it's also getting to the point where it's soon going to overtake Sydney in population. And the problem that we've got is that just becomes unlivable. The only way that densification can happen is to go up, and that puts enormous pressure on our infrastructure, being roads, being transport systems, etc. We're not geared for another 1 million people. And the quality of life, if you throw in another 1 million people upwards into the existing infrastructure, it'll dramatically lower the living standard. And I think there's a lot of Melburnians who probably haven't quite got what that's going to look like yet. It's going to be a dramatic change over the next 10, 20 years in Melbourne. And it's going to mean that metropolitan Melbourne's probably not a place that many people would want to live with that living standard. It's going to be crowded. It's going to be much harder. It's going to be more expensive, because it's just going to drive the cost of everything up. Running a car is going to be much more of a premium, because you just can't get anywhere. You've got 1 million more people battling to get around the suburbs that you already are in. And then you look at other places and you think, well, what about those regional towns, whether it's Sale, whether it's, Bendigo, whether it's Ballarat, whether it's even, parts of Geelong, which are booming. Why don't we want to actually invest in those areas? Because there are plenty of people. I'd live in a regional town if it had all the things I needed to do. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a great lifestyle for your kids. And I just don't understand that the government's approach is to always say, no, we just assume everyone's going to want to live in metropolitan Melbourne. Well, no, we're not. What about the regional towns? Invest in them. They're really good options.
Yeah, but they're not putting the money in there, so people avoid them because they see a lot of interest. They're struggling and they're shrinking. And I mean, and you've got a government that's anti-region. It's like, if you look to satisfy people who are tree huggers and that, and instead of cutting down sustainable timber, even the native forest, they're going to close logging down by the end of the year. So places like Allbust, and it's just going to disappear. There's no way people can stay there without jobs. You've got to have jobs. So, and then add on to that their attack on the regions for those types of jobs. Now you also got the activities like closing off areas to the public, for recreation. Well, starts to go your tourist towns and things like that. But this mindset that's coming from state governments to lock up public land and even acquire current private land and then include it in a park or a locked up area, it seems to be the fad at the moment, and it's really anti-region.
Yeah, and we're seeing even in the Latrobe Valley in Melbourne, which has had such a proud history of power generation for so long. We're seeing the industry there change. The coal industry obviously is changing rapidly, because obviously we're hell bent on renewables and we can't have dirty coal anymore, despite it being the most stable producer of power around the world, apart from nuclear, but we're not allowed to talk about that. And so, you've got these massive changes in industry that are happening, and you've even got the Premier, from his lovely Spring Street office, coming out and just announcing without any consultation not so long ago that it's time to end logging. And here's a date. And as of next year, we're not doing logging anymore. Well, that's really stuffed, in my opinion, and disingenuous on the many generations of logging families who have got sustainable businesses in the Latrobe Valley. And there's the council siding. I was absolutely beyond belief when I saw this happen. Many of the councillors at the Latrobe Valley Council siding with the Premier and saying, yeah, no, we have to close down the logging industry. Well, go and talk to the businesses that you've just destroyed overnight. Go and talk to the people under financial pressure because you've just killed their jobs and their livelihood without an alternative first. Go and talk to them and wonder why the community's up in arms. And then to make matters worse, what we saw in the Latrobe Valley, which was absolutely abhorrent, was that when a protest wanted to happen last week, the council turned its back on the locals and started saying, we will fine you because you don't have a permit and we won't give you a permit to protest. Now, the protest was peaceful. There was no violence. The police were quite happy with the behaviour. And the council, in fact, said to the police, we're going to fine them all. And it resulted in the police having to say, no, this is a huge community issue. We're not going to let you enforce this kind of rubbish on the community. And there you have the police defending the locals who are just trying to protest peacefully because their council wouldn't do the job for them. Now, when you've got councillors who play in that bureaucratic space, it's when you know something's wrong in the DNA and the makeup of councils, that they've completely lost their bureaucratic minds and they are no longer listening to the constituents and hearing what the community needs them to advocate for. I mean, I cannot believe elected councillors and the administration of a council in the Latrobe Valley would actually threaten a protesting crowd where you've shut down one of the major industries without consultation from a stupid decision of the state parliament, a captain's call from the premier. The council goes into bat and backs that. Some of the councillors didn't, obviously, but they're in the minority. And you've got the police as the only lone smart voice saying, no, people have a right to protest. You should let them access the toilets that you're banning them from using. That's unreasonable. You should let them hold their protest and access power and have a permit. And we will not let you fine them for doing this. Please leave the protesters alone. I mean, I say good on Victoria Police for having some common sense. Shame on Latrobe Valley Council. Regional areas don't need their councils behaving like this.
Well, the other thing is you would hope that the local people have a look at the councillors come next election and sort of make a decision in regards to, are these the people the best suited to represent me and my business, my industry, my aspirations, and make that decision at the ballot box.
Bill, I would probably be more blunt than that. I think you're being really kind. I would say to anyone in a regional town, or any council, to be honest, but in a regional town where the council is not listening to you, because we're hearing it here in Victoria, we're hearing that in the city of Hurlston, council decided to implement ridiculous new parking zones that just confuse the hell out of everybody in town. And now they're saying that they're all getting abused and the staff are copying it and it's not safe. Well, one, you didn't actually introduce it properly, consult your community and work out how the community would adapt to the change. So shame on council. And then to have the mayor go out on the radio and the CEO and blame the community, are you out of your collective minds? I would be more blunt and I would say this to anyone in a regional town where your council is not listening to you, where they don't understand what the locals actually want. Next year, particularly in Victoria through the elections in 24, boot the bastards out. The only way you're going to get change is if you actually throw them out at the ballot box and you make it abundantly clear. We saw it in 2020 after scandal after scandal in the Warrnambool City Council. There were, scandal after scandal constantly being played out in the paper, constantly being played out in the public. People had a gutful. And they actually wiped the councillor group out. And that was a fantastic result of people power. And it's the one thing that councillors are scared of. But there's so much apathy in our communities because we're all busy and we're all, don't have the time to take everything in and understand all the machinations within councils. What we would always say is if your councillors are not listening to you and they are just being a front for the administration and pushing back on the will of the people, boot the bastards out at the ballot box, change your council, change the conversation, and have leaders in there who are listening to you and not being fed rubbish from an executive that's just got its own corporate goals, not your goals.
Well, just touching on that executive part, well, I just showed you had 535 council. That means you've got 535 CEOs and chief executive officers. I think our chief executive officer in Cairns runs around about the 400,000 mark. you got I think the chief executive officer in Brisbane, Sydney, and that are up around the 700,000.
Correct. Correct.
But then add to that their expense account, and they go business class everywhere, and they only at work from from 8 to 5 maybe, and they're accountable to almost no one. To my way of thinking, it's a bit of a boys' club or girls' club, some of them, and they just move around from council to council without too much problem in their careers and that. But this is a massive amount of money, that these people are getting, but they're doing a job that is highly regulated. In other words, the processes and procedures are so laid out. It's not like a person who's in a business has to make a risk assessment and whether he spends $1 million here and he's got to get a return. These people are just doing a normal job that's got a set of procedures, yet they're paid this absorbent amount of money. And you multiply that by the 500. Local councils are probably the most costly administrative body in the whole political system. Not that
they are. And Bill, what we know, obviously, you have really expensive CEOs up to 700,000 and 800,000, as you say, which is huge money. And I just want your viewers and listeners to think about this for a moment. That kind of money in the private sector, I tell you what, you'd be getting a pound of flesh. The biggest problem that we have amongst these CEOs and executive leaders in councils is a culture, and it's a culture of entitlement. There is this view that you can only be a CEO within local government if you've been a CEO within local government. And so there is this exclusionary, we don't hire from outside because it's so complex. Bill, I tell you, I know I could go and run a council better than a lot of CEOs. I'd do it for free for 3 months just to prove what a decent CEO can actually do. They would drive innovation, they would drive change, they would drive performance, and they would drive customer service, those things that councils forget about. There are no metrics that really hold councils, accountably publicly. We believe that all councils should have their benchmarks for their customer service standards, their efficiencies, etc., their productivity, their average wage, all of those things should be in the public domain. Because what people don't realise is the vast majority of council positions are paid 30% above the private sector. Now, if we know that they're being paid that level of wage and we're not necessarily getting the performance metrics, when we also, we FOI'd all of the Victorian councils to ask for the CEO's KPIs, I tell you what, we got crickets. Most CEOs didn't even have proper KPIs. They rocked up, turned the lights on and dealt with whatever came their way. Now, if you're on $500,000 a year, that's a job anyone would love to just rock up and deal with. The lack of strategy, the lack of efficiency and the lack of delivery is the problem in local government. And it really needs a complete shake-up, an overhaul and a modernisation. Many of the CEOs are sitting on the gravy train and they are not delivering what we would expect that we would get out of somebody in the private sector on the same wages. It's really a fat cats club full of executives and CEOs who are paid far more than the staff, and the staff are often not treated well at the normal customer service level. They're not treated well while these fat cats are sitting on these massive salaries with no KPIs. I don't know how, Bill, you can have someone sitting on 70 grand a year in a customer service role and they've got harder KPIs than the CEO sitting on 700 grand a year. Something is really wrong in the culture of councils and it's not serving the public.
One of the other important things is the respect that people and voters have for councils. I mean, we had 2 referendums, one in the 70s and one in the 80s, one under Whitlam and one under Hawke Keating. One was to actually allow the Commonwealth to directly fund councils.
Yep.
And the other one was to recognise them as a level of government. I'll just show this screen of those 2 referendums.
Go for it.
Right. The 2 referendum, one in 74, give the Commonwealth powers to borrow money for and make financial assistance directly to any local government body. Now, that lost, there was only one state that agreed. And then the other one was in 88, to recognise local government in the Constitution. In other words, to make it officially a level government. Now, this was a brilliant referendum in regards to this is what people thought of making your local council a level of government. No state won, and the people in favour was only 33%. It's the second poorest referendum we had. So I think people have pretty well got the right attitude towards councils. They're there to do just a job and not be a level of government.
People want quality services and value for money out of their local council. They don't want party politics. They don't want people thinking they're these wonderful elected, heroes that we should be worshipping. They are just local councillors to actually facilitate and represent the local community, drive good value and good delivery of services. That is all people want from councils. They want it to be less complicated and value for money. It's not that difficult. But councils are actually not hearing that. They haven't heard those two referendums, Bill. They're like, no. We see ourselves on the global stage. We are the new United Nations. And that is the joke of local councils. You're not get in your lane and pull your head in.
We wish. The other thing is too, the local councils, besides not being a level of government, and being a bit, what would you say, have delusions of grandeur.
Yes.
They cost an enormous amount of money. Now, I believe they had a role in the past. In fact, when we had the tyranny of distance and we had those sort of problems and you needed local governments to do certain things. Even with planning. But now today in the connected world that we've got, in the global world, where you can lodge application for anything to the state government, to firearms license to the state government, or planning or whatever, from anywhere in Australia or anywhere in the world for that fact. Do you think local governments are maybe past their use by dates because we can do so much ourselves in regards to the processes and that we need to enact to get permits and all that, but of course we still need the delivery of service, but delivery service doesn't necessarily mean you need councillors to decide what's going to happen. Do you think maybe they're past their use by date, at least in the metropolitan areas so much?
Well, yeah, what we see in metropolitan areas definitely is we see an over bureaucracy of a bureaucracy. There's always a new process and a form to do what we already did or what we could do online, but we've got to complicate it, overcomplicate it, reinvent it, and do it 7 different ways. For anyone who navigates councils, as we regularly are dealing with councils across all of Victoria, and certainly dealing with complaints that are coming in, the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic attitudes are unbelievable. We literally have people who are doing a job just to actually create more processes or bureaucracy, not necessarily the right process. And so what we keep seeing is this duplication and triplication of roles in councils that is unnecessary. The funny thing is, Bill, in every conversation I ever have with CEOs or executive directors in councils, whenever we're talking about a function or doing something, guess what the first thing they say is, well, we're going to need to hire more staff for that. So there's never an understanding of you don't need more staff to fix a problem or to address something. Sometimes you actually have to deal with the problem, work out what you can do to fix it, and it may involve long-term that you don't need as many staff. That's what efficiency, that's what technology does, but no, not councils. And the fact is that there's 79 of them, right? So just think Victoria, think the same processes across 530 odd councils in Australia. You've got 79 councils in Victoria, all essentially doing the same thing, but 79 different ways. Some will still require a form for an application for a permit. Some will require you to use a special portal that they actually have designed, probably spent $20 million doing. You've got to get a login, you've got to log into that, you've got to use that, you need a bit of help. Others will be you can just apply on an email. Others will be you can apply directly online. Others will be, oh, you've got to go to our outsourced provider. And there is another issue. So many of the basic functions of councils, think rubbish, think anything else, is getting outsourced more and more by the day. And what I think councils are actually proving to themselves is that they can't do it themselves cost effectively, but they've got to go to private enterprise, that their wages are too high, and that's why they're going to contractors who don't have to pay the same wages. Well, that tells you have a problem. And three, when it is outsourced, it's never got the same service standards or the same recourse when, customers are let down or residents are let down. And so we're getting substandard service from a contractor that we don't really have any enforcement rights against. What is it that councils are now doing? Not much bloody well, that's for sure. What they're really good at doing is shuffling paper, writing reports, and shifting responsibility to other people. And it's not my fault. That is what bureaucracy does. And the more we layer it with bureaucracy and administration, the less effective they're going to be. It's no coincidence, Bill, that across every state in Australia, council satisfaction is at its lowest level in 20 years. Now, isn't that interesting? The more they outsource, the more bureaucracy they add, the more administration to fix the problems they add, the more dissatisfied we're getting.
More departments and more so-called responsibilities, social and bloody climate change and all the rest.
Correct.
But I think the interesting thing you did point out is the regions and that, and the poor deal they get in regards to the funding and things like that. But I do have a solution for the regions, right? We have a constitution, and no one looks at our constitution. Even our politicians. I know a couple of politicians that never picked it up in the life because they don't know some of the chapters that you're quoting in that. But there's chapter 6 there. It says create new states. Now, Australia progressed from being, when settled, just New South Wales as a colony. It progressed by making these other colonies. Well, maybe it's time for more progress for regional, say regional Western Victoria and regional Eastern Victoria become new states instead of being told to what they're going to get from Melbourne. And that's the same for North Queensland's and that. I think growing the regions is going to be the best thing for Australia in regards to wealth creation, because
agree.
Wealth will never be created in our capital cities. It doesn't matter how much they spend on roads, airports, infrastructure, or whatever. It will never generate a dollar wealth. It will just maybe turn dollars over, but it won't ever generate new wealth. It won't grow wheat, and it won't raise a sheep. It won't raise cattle. It won't have a heavy industry or anything like that. Maybe I think your council watch might be sort of, especially to regional councils and areas, push them into the idea of having a look at chapter 6. I mean, the Melbourne politicians won't want to do it, but it's there somehow. But
Melbourne's unfortunately got a few of its own issues that I think we need a change of government, and there's no alternative at the moment. But we need a huge change in government and a huge change in policy to stop being so bloody CBD centric.
I think more than that, the Australians need to have a bit change in mindset and get over the apathy and get involved, rather than just go with the flow until it hurts me. And I think that's probably the biggest problem. We're seeing Australians be very passive over the last 3 and 4 years, and their engagement to politics is very poor. And then they turn to wondering why they're getting these results. So I think
I think you're right, Bill. Apathy is the enemy of us as people. We are seeing, what's interesting is the more it's hurting in cost of living, because when you change legislation and it's inalienable, it doesn't really affect me. It's kind of like, oh yeah, it's changing. But now that it's really starting to hurt and screw people in the pocket, it's not easy. It's getting harder for everybody, and it's pushing people to far worse financial extremes than before. The more that happens, unfortunately, the byproduct of that is people start losing the apathy pretty quickly, because they're in a fight to be able to feed themselves and pay their bills. And the more that happens, the more councils and levels of government are actually likely to be held to account, and the more there hopefully will be a bit more of people revolution in interest and getting involved and actually saying, you know what, if they are bastards who don't represent us, we want to kick them out.
Well, the hip pocket is a big teller, isn't it? And I think that's especially with energy prices and that. that's probably going to make a lot of people have a bit of a second look. Oh, are we doing the right thing in regards to the way we're heading with electricity? Because all I can see is being energy poverty being a lot higher, and when that affects your mum, you got elderly parents in their house and they're only on a pension. You can see the hardship they come. I think hardship will probably wake up a lot of people and hopefully get over this apathy that we've got and sort of get engaged.
Yeah, that's our hope. That's our hope, certainly.
We've gone over the hour. It was fairly easy too, wasn't it? If you'd just like to sort of wind up with a bit of an overview of Council Watch and the things you're involved in over the next few months, please go ahead.
So obviously I'd encourage, whilst we're predominantly at this stage Victorian based, I will give you a bit about that. I'd encourage all of your viewers and listeners to actually head to our website, councilwatch.com.au, have a look at what we do. We originally started 21, 22 years ago as kind of ratepayers associations. And what we realised was that there was no one speaking properly. And in the last couple of years, we've reformed into Council Watch, where we're much more investigative. So, we use FOIs like they're lollies. We FOI everything. We get, we get the information about councils and we expose it in investigations. We work really closely with the media to tell the stories, to actually explain what's happening in regional areas, in metropolitan areas, what councils are doing, what good decisions they're making when we find them, and what the dumb decisions are. Unfortunately, they're a lot easier to find. And we really focus on expenses as well. Like, what is it that your council's spending money on, and should they be? And that's really been a huge driver. One of the things that's running at the moment is The Voice. And we've been calling out councils who are actually spending money on what is ultimately a federal referendum that is funded by, the federal government, both sides of the debate, and doesn't need council money to tell the story. But some councils are a little bit deluded that they think it's their role to be spending $50,000 or $100,000 promoting the yes vote on a federal referendum where it's already, adequately funded. So what we do is we really use social media and we use our, the internet to actually really reach out and tell people stories and tell them what's happening. Because with the loss of so many local papers across most of Australia, local council stories have just gone under the radar, and councils love it because it means they get away with blue murder. So we've found there's a huge appetite for people to find out what's really going on in their local area. Now, I will give regional towns a huge plug here. Regional towns are far more clued into what's going on in their local council by default, because the communities are much more close and invested in discussing these issues as a standard. Whereas, dopey cousins like me sitting in metropolitan Melbourne, it's really easy to not know what's happening in your local council. So, it is really about educating the city folk a little bit more, because we're a little bit naive about these things. But in saying that, we have had overwhelming response from, other states like WA, Queensland and New South Wales, where there is a real appetite for this kind of organisation to expand. So dare I say, in the next couple of years, you will see Council Watch popping up everywhere. Our goal is to represent every one of those 520 councils in Australia, so that they actually Sorry, mate?
The ratepayers of those.
Correct. To represent the communities that are actually being served or not served by their local councils. And it doesn't take a lot. It's actually really easy to do. So if anyone out there is listening that thinks, you know what, I'd love to have a council watch in my home state or in my local regional area, get in touch on our website, get in touch. We are absolutely in the planning stage now. We want to see strong communities holding their councils and their public money to account. We want transparency and bang for buck. They're the most important things we can have with public money.
Well, I think there's plenty of sort of ratepayers associations around, and I've seen some of the Facebook pages and that they'd be obviously a collective sort of target to
Correct.
The umbrella, and some of them do a good job, but
Yes,
it's one person trying to do this and trying to do that and hasn't really got a full grasp on it, like obviously your people have got their teeth into. So that's probably be welcomed by them for to have that support and knowledge base to make them more professional and more effective as well.
And it's really about reinventing what the ratepayers group is. In the past, the ratepayers group is a very different thing to what works today. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work, but it requires a lot more social media, public speaking, and a lot more media savvy kind of storytelling. And what we've found is that Council Watch has been a much better vehicle to be able to actually act kind of like a media corporation who's telling the real stories behind council. And let me tell you, it gets really juicy. We get lots of really good whistleblowing from staff and councillors, and it keeps it very interesting.
Well, the other thing too, be interesting is the fact you would be incorporated either as an association or a body or something, whereas a lot of these ratepayer groups are just probably only got a Facebook page, and they don't have that. They don't actually have that incorporation safety net that they really need when you're sort of taking into the public sphere. So that's definitely an advantage, to scoop those sort of groups into that type of entity where you've got that sort of protection, which is completely, you're silly to go without it these days when you're dealing with public and government.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Some councillors love what we do, some don't, and they're probably the ones that don't want to say things that they're doing. But interestingly, collectively, unintentionally, our biggest group of critics and non-fans would be the CEOs of councils. And we kind of feel if the CEOs and executives, not the rank and file staff, if the CEOs and executives are our number one enemy, we're doing something right, because they don't want us to hold them to account. And number two, we know, this is so funny, but we hear it all the time. We know that we are one of the most loved, social media platforms that council, ordinary rank and file council staff love reading information about their council on. They love seeing the dirt on their council actually being exposed and them not under any threat for doing so. So it is quite amusing. We do have, we're not here to defame anyone, of course, but we're pretty brutal at times as well. We will call out really bad conduct and bad behaviour in public office because we should. We don't go after the staff, but we do hold the leadership of councils to account.
Well, that's all you can really do, and let the public know.
Correct.
Look, Dean, thanks very much for your time. It's really been appreciated, and it's been a very lively, enjoyable conversation. You're a bit of a showman, I think.
Never.
Just stay on the line. I'll introduce the next week's guest, and then we'll have a little chat.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks very much, Dean. Look, if you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, I'm going to interview Graham Young from the Australian Institute of Progress. And they've just put in their submission to the Queensland Government's Energy Transformation Bill 2023. And we're going to have an interesting talk about that bill and some of the fairy dust, unicorn poo and rainbows that are in that, because those targets are never going to be actioned, but the wording is such that they will proceed no matter what, and it doesn't matter how much it's going to cost you. So please join me next week when we talk to Graham Young. Thank you.